I've waited a couple extra minutes because, we're just not, this is just wrong. It's just wrong. This morning, Kathy reaches over and touches me and says, it's 7 o'clock? And I looked at the clock and I was like, oh, yeah, we didn't set the clocks, did we? Let's get up, get going. Fortunately, I had already written my sermon. So, we are continuing in our discussion about atonement. And on Wednesday night, we did a little bit more unpacking, thinking about what the Jewish model was. And so we're still operating. I want to be clear, I always want to go back and say, what's the question that's being answered? And the question that was being answered was different in different eras. The initial question was, why did this have to happen? Why did it have to happen to Jesus? Of course, that would have been the initial shocking question that would have happened in the days in between Good Friday and Easter in our mythological telling of all of this. And the early Jewish followers of Jesus had a very Jewish idea about that, and it was sacrifice-oriented. But we have to have some education in our context about what sacrifice means, because we don't think about it. We don't come from a sacrificial religious model, and so we don't think about it in those ways. And we also, I think, if we're honest, think about that as primitive and foolish and barbaric and all of those things. And there's a depth to that it's important to kind of unpack. So we did some of that, and we talked about that on Wednesday. We brought out the theological map again. I guess I should just own this in pronouns. I brought out the theological map. Nobody was asking for it. And we'll talk about it some because, again, I think it's helpful for people who are, which is the majority of us here, who are in some process of kind of deconstructing their previous faith background and reconstructing a new faith background, to understand this mapping helps give some framework to that. So when you change your mind about what you think about any one of these things, it impacts all of the others. That's the gist of the map. But today we're going to talk specifically about penal substitutionary atonement, or PSA for short. Not a public service announcement. This is the dominant theory of atonement, and it's probably the only one you've ever been taught. It's what you taught. This is what atonement is. And it goes like this. Okay, so there's humankind, mankind. There's some Bible verses attached to it. Now you'll note when you see doctrines like this, or when you see theories like this within theological circles, you will get scripture hurled at you like like it's a fire hose of stuff, but it's all bits and pieces, right? So we're going to take a line from this is Romans 3:23, a verse from Romans and a verse from Isaiah, and we're going to say those are saying the same things, right? And we're going to take a verse from Romans later and a verse from you'll see Romans, by the way, over and over and over again, and a verse from Hebrews, and we're going to say those are saying the same things. These are, like in this case, these two particular pieces of writing were hundreds of years apart from each other in totally different contexts. And then we'll do the same, but the basic math is there's this sin, everybody sinned, here's sin's penalty. Sin and death have this, they're at least related, they're at least parallel, but it's kind of hard to know, are we talking about, and so here's a little side note, often to just a short visit down a rabbit trail, and then we're going to come right back, I promise. So if I start really drifting, like throw something at me. So the short, throw something soft at me. I just heard somebody go like, oh. The sin and death thing is this sort of metaphysical notion. So it's not necessarily, this is present throughout all of Paul's letters, it's not necessarily your death. It's death as in the sense of death is a place we are separated from God. And life is a place where we are with God. And so you have this life and death argument going on all the time. So I think Paul would argue you could be alive, like living your life, and be dead. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So here's the sin and the death thing, and then on the other side is God and life. And you have these, you have to receive Christ, and you have to have assurance of salvation, for it's Christ who paid the penalty, right? That bridges the gap. Here is this gap between us and God, and this is because of original sin. We'll talk about that. And then the gap is closed. Substitutionary atonement is the theory that Jesus was a sacrifice punished in the place of humans, thus paying the price, the demands of justice for our sin, so that God could forgive our sins. There's just so many problems with it, just to saying that short sentence. But it's a difficult doctrine to absorb, especially if you think God has anything to do with love, or if you wonder, well, why is God bound by justice? And particular, why is God bound by justice the way we understand justice? It seems to really limit who and what God is. And it makes it challenging. So here's your funny cartoon. As Leon unfurled the piece of paper, he knew he would never again play charades with ministers. Yeah, do that one, right? That's a tough one. So you have probably heard at some point in your religious upbringing, if that's where you came from, maybe even if that's not where you came from, you've heard statements like Christ died for our sins, or Christ died for your sins. His blood paid the price. You've heard the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. That's a high church kind of thing. His blood made us whole. One of my favorite sort of equations that gets put out there, 1 cross plus 3 nails equals 4 given. Have you seen this? Right. It's just simple math, friends. This theory, like most atonement theories, rests on the idea of sin as a problem, defined most clearly in the idea of original sin. Oh, no, not that original sin. Original sin, yes, that one. Now, the theological theories, and let me emphasize again, they are theories of original sin and penal substitutionary atonement, were actually developed centuries apart from one another, but they are, in our context, intrinsically connected. The original sin of Adam and Eve, we were told, stains all human beings with this bitter mark as the central feature of their humanity. It was a concept not found in the Bible, but developed by a theologian, Augustine, in the 5th century. Most Christians have never been told that it was not original with the earliest followers of Jesus, that it developed in a different context hundreds of years later, or that it relies heavily upon the idea of God's punishment and a very retributive notion of justice, which again was not present for the first several hundred years. This is Augustine in his context. We just accept that like it's what it's always been. And it should be noted, this might seem very natural, for we are surrounded at all times by retributive systems of so-called justice and media that reinforces this idea, right? There you go. That was the whole thing of Passion of the Christ, that movie when that came out. Yeah. Yeah. We have embedded in us these notions of original sin and penal substitution, and they impact how we create systems of justice and law, and of course, really emphasize the idea that violence is somehow redemptive, as in we can bomb our way to peace. Right? These ideas are so deeply embedded in us that we read words like blood or sin or death in the Bible, and we think that Paul or the author of Revelation are talking about this very framework of original sin and substitutionary atonement, when that is not in their mindset at all. That's hundreds of years later. We are rarely told honestly these are theories, even though some groups take it as long-standing dogma. Because of its prevalence, particularly in Protestant theology, this theory has limited many people's ideas of what the concepts are within Christianity and robbed them of the depth of options that exist. As Richard Rohr writes, himself a Catholic theologian, this combo of original sin and substitutionary atonement has led to some serious misunderstandings of Jesus' role and Christ's eternal purpose. It's reaffirmed our narrow notion of retributive justice and legitimated a notion of good and necessary violence. It implied, he writes, that God was petty, offended in the way that humans are. Notice how human God seems in this whole equation, yes? And unfree to love and forgive of God's own volition. It's a very untrustworthy image of God which undercuts everything else. That's Rohr's comments. Right. And also, what does it say about love? It makes love very transactional, makes love very conditional, and makes love something that sometimes you just have to be violent. We hear that language all the time. And yet, here we are. So, in order to unpack PSA, we start with original sin. And I want to say, as a concept, I'm not totally against original sin. That may be shocking to you. Here's how I see it. There is something that feels inherent in humankind, a fundamental brokenness, if you will, brokenness. It always creeps into everything. It corrupts even the best of ideas, leaving me to think that at least we do all have a crack in us, right? Some kind of flaw. Where I break from original sin is first making that into a doctrine, and second, assigning it as the defining component of humanity instead of a part of humanity. I mean, there's also good in everyone, so why not make that the doctrine? That's the original blessing doctrine, right? Augustine of Hippo, look at him. He's a very thoughtful guy. He's really deep in thought. He's wondering, does everybody else see that little kid over there, or what is going on? He was a Neoplatonist. Ooh, there's your 75-cent word for the day, meaning he was schooled in the thought of Plato, except Neoplatonism was magnified in certain areas, particularly dualism. He saw things in black and white, good and evil, spirit and flesh. And that last one I threw in there on purpose because although he became a Christian, Augustine always had a tough time reconciling a religion in which God, spirit, good, had become human, flesh, bad. Okay? Now, Augustine or Augustine, you can say either one of those. Augustine doesn't create original sin ex nihilo, which means from nothing, but builds on ideas that Paul and others had until he first uses the phrase in his spiritual memoir, Confessions, in which he writes that Adam's sin is inherited Therefore, all human beings have a hostile relationship to God, at least prior to Jesus. And he builds this off of Romans 5, in which Paul says, this is Romans 5, verse 12, therefore, just as through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, thus death has spread to all men because all sinned. Now, again, that's one line out of a complex argument in Romans. Paul's perhaps his most theological letter, in which he's really unpacking things, and he's talking to a group of people he's never met. And he's trying to explain what his position is. And this is an ecclesia, a collection of Jesus followers in the belly of the beast in Rome. Right there amongst the Roman Empire. And so he's doing his darndest to explain all of this stuff out. And we take one line out of it and build a doctrine. I mean, it's crazy. Interpreting Paul has become a centuries-long endeavor. Humans inherited something from Adam, he says, but what? And again, we're also wrestling with the English here, and we miss all the depth of the Greek. And we also know Paul was a Pharisaic Jew, so had this deep connection to a Jewish history and a Jewish understanding. And language really matters, friends. And we miss a lot when we go from one language to the next. So Paul then says in Romans 5:18, just as one man's trespasses led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. The operative question is, do you believe that God would punish you for another person's sin, namely Adam? Because that's what Augustine did with this. If the answer is no, then you are still, to be fair, stuck with the whole murder of the Messiah problem that is significant theologically and culturally. Why did Jesus die? You're still stuck with that. But if you see this marker of seemingly inherited sin present in each person, which isn't hard to do, you can extrapolate those words of Paul and decide what he's describing is the origin of sin, and therefore the problem that Jesus' horrible and unimaginable death resolves. In fact, the more necessary it is, the more palatable it becomes, because this is what we do to help us find meaning in horrible loss. Augustine read Paul's words in Romans as a clear statement that every human being is born already scarred by sin. His view was that Paul understood the story in the early chapters of Genesis to be an explanation of this undisputable reality. As a result, Augustine declared that the deliberate sin of the first man is the cause of original sin. Now, what that sin means, we go back to that idea of sin and death. Are these the same thing? Are they different things? In the Eastern tradition of the church, what is interpreted is that we inherited death from Adam. We were eternal beings, but no longer eternal after we leave the garden, and we've inherited death from Adam. The Western tradition stuck with Augustine. We inherited death and guilt from Adam. But wait, there's more. Then came Calvin, 1,000 years later in the Protestant Revolution, who upped the ante even more. He argued that our inherent sinfulness erased virtually all traces of God's image within us. We inherit death and guilt and total depravity. He's a cheery guy, that Calvin. Now, little asterisk here. Calvinists do offer that total depravity is different than absolute depravity. Total depravity, which sounds pretty complete to me, it's total, allows that human beings can do some good things. But absolute depravity rules all of that out. They're still depraved, but they can manage to do a few good things here and there. Okay? This is such a manifest doctrine that it's difficult to imagine Orthodox Christian expression in the West without these components. That's how much they are part of the tradition from which we come. But that doesn't make it right, doesn't even make it biblically accurate. We can note that there's a tendency towards sin or evil or selfishness or greed or however you want to say that in humankind without affirming either original sin or total depravity. They're just theories that built on each other. Also keep in mind, Calvin, as he's building this, is also trying to build a society. And he's trying to build a system with the church at the center in which you need that cog to be as strong as it possibly can be. And, in the crudest way to put it, if you are totally depraved and your only hope is Jesus and the church holds the key to Jesus, it's a pretty good system for compliance. Right. Empires think it that way too. Paul adds, so we go back to Paul. Paul adds to Genesis. Then we go to Augustine. Augustine adds to Paul. Then we go to Calvin. Calvin adds to Augustine. And then we can get into the ties to more recent stuff like the nonsense that is the Left Behind theology that is prevalent right now, all tied together, a house of cards. And stuck in that same stack is penal substitutionary atonement. We can also call this the payment model. We start with your inherited debt, original sin, and then add all of your other sins, you naughty person, and you have a debt you cannot pay. There's no bankruptcy court in God's justice. All debts must be paid. Hold on to that unprocessed central part of the argument. Let's just set that over here for a second, right? That this is God's justice and it must be met like our justice is met. Okay. So the price is paid by Jesus with his death, a demand of justice, demand of God's honor, which, again, looks a lot like us. It personifies God in a really direct way, also an unspoken way. Like, we don't talk about that. We just simply say God's justice is like our justice. And hopefully we are not then following along to say God's love is like our love, because like I said at Wednesday night, I hope God's love is way better than my love. Along comes Anselm. Anselm, a 11th century monk. Let's see, do I have a picture of Anselm in here? Oh, look, I had the text in there. I have an incomplete slideshow. Well, now you're just seeing everything. We got to get back to the... Who knows what I have open on my computer? Yeah, we'll just do that. Anselm, an 11th century monk, lawyer, theologian, the Archbishop of Canterbury, which then was a Catholic position, now is a Protestant position. In fact, they've just named the first woman ever as Archbishop of Canterbury. In his book, Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man, Anselm was rebutting the commonly held view of atonement at that time. So this is after Augustine, several hundred years after Augustine. The prevalent atonement theory at that time was called the ransom theory, which basically said that Jesus was a ransom paid to redeem humanity. And we'll come back to the ransom theory in more depth later. But that was the prevalent one at that time. The important part is that it asserted that a payment had to be made in order for humanity to be redeemed, to be rescued or ransomed from that original sin. But to whom is the ransom paid? In Anselm's time, many Western Christians had come to believe that the ransom for humanity's redemption was owed to the devil. Okay? Anselm, to be blunt, thought this idea was stupid. So he altered or adapted the model. So the basic idea of PSA is that for God to be just, God had to pour out his wrath against human sin in order to be able to forgive humans for sinning. Otherwise, God's forgiveness would be unjust. Right. So let's just sit with that for a moment. I mean, that's the logic here. Now, to be fair, it's 11th century logic. In its context, which is not our context, it may make a lot of sense. But we could ask ourselves, well, I'll come back to that question in just a second. So God pours out God's wrath on the sinless human, Jesus, God incarnate, and thereby satisfies that justice through Jesus' crucifixion. So we're going to look at this atonement theory by asking a series of questions, which we'll ask of all of the atonement theories that you'll hear, the same set of questions. But the first set of questions, and here's where we enter into the group conversation portion of our program. What does this model say about God? Yeah. This is open mic time. What do you think this model, penal substitutionary atonement, says about God?
To me, this is not a kind and loving God, because, if Jesus is the creation of God and God is love, why would he deliberately, send somebody to get killed in such a gruesome manner for everybody else?
Okay. Anyone else? I see by furrowed brows you don't have to say what it is that you think this says about God. I see the furrowed brows. Let me ask the question a slightly different way. Having been taught this theory, perhaps not as explicitly as I've taught it just now, and having been taught the logic of that theory, although, again, probably never in this paragraph form that I just gave you, who, by a show of hands amongst us, always or felt some problem with the way that you were told meaning was made around the death of Jesus? Okay, it's a fairly high number. Okay, and how did your if you were bold enough or had a place to ask a question about that, who had an answer that was dramatically different than quit asking so many questions? You just have to trust. Nobody else? Okay, nobody? Okay. What do we think this model says about Jesus? Who is Jesus?
It kind of takes Jesus out of the equation. It kind of makes him a non-person. It just kind of is like, here, there is a person here as a scapegoat or like placeholder for you. You're going there next.
Yep. Okay. Jesus is just a cog in the machine. Okay.
A patsy. So Jesus is God walking with us.
Yeah, maybe.
Dying for us.
I mean, yeah. Now we're talking about like two different kinds of doctrine things, but it was a problem also for lots of people, which is to say, well, wait a second. If I am Trinitarian in my ideas of things and understand Jesus to be God, God is killing God in order to appease God, right? right? Yeah.
I would think some of the Catholic, like going back to Christmas story, it's important that Jesus be born of a virgin and immaculately and be sinless, and Jesus is just the perfect sacrifice. So it kind of almost puts Jesus as some sort of subject instead of a person.
So now we're mixing our models, aren't we? We're mixing our models because that's the Jewish notion of sacrifice. Jesus has to be sinless because he has to be an unblemished animal, like we talked about in the Jewish tradition. You want a goat with no markings on it whatsoever. Why do you want that? This is where we diverge a little bit. Justin may have something to say about this. This is where we diverge a little bit. You want a goat without blemish because you want the goatiest goat you can have. You want a perfect goat, right? You also want a Jesus who is without blemish because you want the most human to pay for all the humans. Does that make sense? You down with that, Justin? Okay.
Just as visual for me, instead of Jesus bringing us closer to God, it looks like he's keeping us separate.
Oh, yeah. Is he a bridge or is he is he pushing them? Yeah. Okay. Ooh.
I think the first thing looking at that chart that just made me go, what? Salvation not by works?
Right.
This
is I couldn't take it off of here because it's really not salient to our argument, but it is part of the equation here. Yeah.
Slapped me in the face. It was like, what?
Well, so you can tell where this comes from. This comes from the Calvinist influence. It's the equation that's there because this piece is in here. And the Calvinist approach said that we don't, much like Luther, it's not our works. Our salvation is by grace alone. Right. An interpretation of Paul. Yeah. By grace, baptism part of our grace, part of God's grace, right? We're baptized into that grace. But we don't do anything to achieve that, which is could be interpreted as, so once I've got the grace, it doesn't matter what I do. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, what if they all just kind of got wrapped up in these ideas and they're totally wrong?
Yeah.
What if God and Jesus agreed, well, let's just send me down there and see what happens with human will, with free will.
Yeah.
And look what happened.
Yeah.
But God gave us free will. And that allows, as a result of that, we make mistakes, we sin. And sometimes not innocently. But we can have all these conversations around this and totally not be getting. I mean, I don't know what lesson we're supposed to get, but anyway, that's all.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're doing and what other people I hear are doing is it's very hard to have a conversation about one of these doctrines or theories without also talking about the other ones. And it's because, the Western Christian tradition comes out of a framework which for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the line between philosophy and theology was non-existent. Anselm was a philosopher, right? You already heard Augustine was a Neoplatonist. He was very much invested in philosophy. Also, Anselm wasn't a lawyer. Like, they didn't have lawyers in the way that we have now segregated these things out into different pieces. In fact, I would argue that right now, if I'm telling you you're going to have a panel discussion up here, and I'm going to have a theologian and a philosopher, do you think they're going to be on the same side?
Maybe not.
I mean, the chances are you might initially go, oh, well, we have a one side and the other, right? That was not the case when we were growing up. So all of these things are very philosophically constructed, and they build on each other. And so it's very hard for us now to critique one without, oh, what am I suggesting? It's hard to critique one without the others being impacted. So we could write this theological map as a philosophical doctrinal map and say, hey, if you change your idea about penal substitutionary atonement, some of these others are going to be impacted too. Does that make sense? Okay.
So my understanding is Eastern Christian Orthodoxy is more focused on love. How do they have the same problems that this model?
So they don't have penal substitutionary atonement as a model. I mean, they know it exists. It's one of the theories. It's not the one that has kind of seized the day there. They use a different model for that. And I don't want to get, because we're going to cover the models, but there's several different models that we'll ask these same questions of, and they come up with very different answers. Yeah.
So I know this is all centered around Easter and resurrection,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I also understand from my own study of Christian theology and mysticism that the birth of the Christ story is centered around the pagan calendar,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is the darkest night of the year.
Sure.
And
the
then
solstice. Mm-hmm.
the cross in Jesus' resurrection is around the spring celebration
That is
of
correct.
new life.
That's right.
So I want to know, at what point did the cross, at what point did this story come to be associated with the spring celebration?
So that's difficult to answer, other than to say that my simplest way to answer that is to say when the Roman Empire becomes Christian and Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire, it takes an imperial framework to it. And the imperial framework is one of belonging and of obedience and adherence to a set of beliefs and a set of doctrines. And so that shifts the framework of Christianity pretty substantially. The Romans were really, really good when they conquered places at trying to assimilate people. And so one of the things that they did was to say, as we conquer you, you conquered peoples, we don't care what gods you have. You can worship those gods. You just also have to worship our gods. And by worship, we really mean make sure you pay your taxes, your tribute to Caesar, who is a god. Okay? That was a way of kind of so they had this very natural approach in an imperial mindset. When they moved out to places, they noticed that they had these festivals at these times, and there seemed to be, we don't really know historically when Jesus was born. Sorry, probably wasn't December 25th, sorry. And we don't really know when Easter happened, although the story says it's around Passover, right? So we know that but Passover moves around. So we just kind of know generally when it is. It's in the spring, right? So there were these already happening festivals, and in order to assimilate the people more easily, they just added their story to their story. They just mushed those stories together, right? And we get a lot of those things, like a Christmas tree is kind of a remnant of some of that, and some of our traditions are sort of a remnant of some of those components, because that just got all mixed up like that. The point for the imperial Christianity was your allegiance. And if we got that through that, yeah.
Which is what this penal substitutionary atonement is all about. It's about allegiance.
It is about allegiance. I mean, it's a great model for an empire. You
Tracy
can
was-
say that.
Oh, sorry. Tracy was saying, you know how you asked her, what does this say about God or whatever? She says it, to her, it says more about mankind. And like,
yeah.
like you said, we are the one putting God in a box and saying how we're making God human-like in our thought process of,
That's right.
of, you know.
God's logic has to be our logic.
Right. But I'm mad again, as always.
Yeah.
That I, bought this stuff hook, line, and sinker. I never questioned a thing. I just
shouldn't.
took it.
You shouldn't be mad
took
at
it.
yourself, though, because this is precisely what it's designed to do. And listen, if nothing has come true to us, has been made more real to us in the sort of post-COVID world, in the post-George Floyd world, is that we had this awakening towards all kinds of things that we had not questioned up until that point. And we have a history that we've been taught that is incomplete. We have a cultural assumption about what it is to be in America and what it is to be American that is really being exposed right now, right? And so that's part of we have the same tension. It's part of that same tension that we would have in a religious context. And we need not be hard on ourselves for not, because there was a purposeful path that we were kind of pushed on. Yeah.
Well, apart from the fact that it makes God this angry, cruel being, the problem for
Just
me,
apart from that, just
apart
that
from
tiny
that,
little thing, yes.
which was initially my main problem with it, but it makes Jesus' life and teachings unimportant.
Yeah.
And it makes our behavior unimportant.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. There's nothing about his life. It's all about his death. And let's notice something else. Here's an Eastern Orthodox Western break. Where's Easter in this? We have the cross, and we have death. He paid the penalty, but we don't have Easter. In the Eastern model, which has its own problems, I'm not trying to say they got it right and we got it wrong. The Eastern model focuses much more on the resurrection as the story here, not the death. So we'll ask a couple more questions. We're going to run out of time here. So, what is this model, the PSA model? How does it make sense of violence? What does it think of violence?
Necessary.
Inevitable, necessary, redemptive. That's the thing that pays the price, right? And as we get through Calvin with penal substitutionary atonement, which is an adaptation of substitutionary atonement, it's the penal part. So it's not just the death, it's the suffering alongside the death, which is what you see heavily promoted. This is why people were both aghast and celebratory of Passion of the Christ, where you see a horribly bloody death of Jesus. And that is, to people who are in that PSA camp, makes it all the better. It elevates torture as a mechanism, that's right. And then what is that again? If we see that as salvific, what does that mean for us in terms of what we do in our own families? What does it mean for us when we have power? How do we use power?
Like when you think about, I'd say punishing your kids, but yeah, punishing your kids.
That's right.
Like, we grew up with whoopings.
Spoil the rod.
Yeah.
Spare the
Spare the
rod,
rod,
spoil the child.
Yeah.
Now, spoil the rod, that's crazy.
that was considered the right thing to do, you
Yeah.
know. So
It says to us, God is violent, and violence is a means of redemption. Gives us an angry God. And preachers who can say, God hates some of you. Right? So where is the love? Is there love in this model? It does ask us to consider what we think about love. So here's the three questions that I have for you. Is love just? Does love demand equal scales? Does it demand equal scales? Does it demand a balance? Does love demand payment? You have wronged me, you must pay. Love is apart from those things. Okay? We have a hard time, I think, conceptualizing love outside of our own relationships with people. Of course, that's what we do. That's how we know what love is. Or, conversely, it's how we don't know what love is, or how we get really bad models for love. So, from a family systems point of view, as the son of a family systems therapist, this is for you, Mom. The idea of absorbing and inheriting and believing and having the embedded idea in you that love demands justice, and that violence can redeem that in some way and get you to that love, has warped a lot of families and given people really, really bad models for what love is supposed to be. And it's everything from, very, very fractured, abusive relationships, all the way to a church that can say, love the sinner, hate the sin. Which is, again, a justice-oriented, a equal. It's a very angry sort of notion. It just takes away people's humanity. So we have to think about an atonement theory based more on love, at least love as we understand it. And I have to recognize that as I base that model, and I seek a loving God, that I hope to build a model that's even better than my own ideas about that, because my own ideas are fractured and broken and just as impacted by all of this nonsense as everybody else's. In the same way that when you grow up in a country that was founded on racism, it's very hard for you not to be racist. Now, it's remember that racism is what we do, it's not what we are. So then we start thinking about, what's our identity? Sin is what we do, it's not what we are. That's a whole different model. And I can say that in the same sort of illogical manner that I then say to you, and I can also say we're all sinners. Not as an identity, but as a notion that we all miss the mark. We all fall short. We all are not perfect in our engagements. What the Western Christian tradition has done, really driven a lot by this, is made that into an identity. Something that we inherently are. Total depravity is not something you do. I mean, I guess it could be something you do, but it is not meant by Calvin to be something that you do. It is something that you are. Original sin is something that you are, forever stained by this. So part of our task is excising these demons, which were built at a time in which that made sense. So I wanted you to hear about Anselm's context so that you understood he was pushing back against an equally problematic atonement theory and just created one that was more problematic. It made sense to him. I mean, and when you think about the notion that for God to be just, God had to pour out his wrath against human sin in order to be able to forgive humans for sinning. Otherwise, God's forgiveness would be unjust. That feels exactly like something, no offense, a lawyer would say, or a philosopher would say, right? You read the sentence and then you go, I need to read that again. I think I need to read that one more time. Right? It's heavy sledding kinds of stuff. And he was trying to work all of that out in a context in which he was looked to for these answers. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Right. Yeah.
You mentioned Richard Rohr earlier, and today's reading was about sin. And sin, in his view, and I tend to agree with this, is simply my separation from God.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Yeah.
So in some ways, that image still works.
Yeah.
Without all the
Yeah.
verses and stuff. It's
It does.
just
Yeah.
if I'm separated from God, I'm dead.
Yeah.
If I'm connected with God, I'm alive. And Jesus shows me the path of how to connect with God, not through sacrifice or death, just how to be in this world.
It still begs the question of how, right?
Yes.
How does that happen? What does that mean? How do I engage in that? Right? So that's why we lead into these other atonement theories who have some other answers for why and how that happens. We'll ask that same series of questions. What does this model say about God? What does it say about Jesus? How does it make sense of violence? What does it mean for us spiritually? And where is the love? We will ask those questions of all of those theories.
And then the last piece is when I'm connected with God and I'm in life, then I'm in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, we have a paradise component, right, that we haven't really taught. This is all based on this mythological Genesis story. How do we get separated from that? How do we get back? We've just got to get ourselves back to the garden. That'd be a good song. Okay. All right, so next Sunday, Justin's going to take over and look at some of the other models of atonement, and we're going to kind of move through those, asking that series of questions about them. And then, of course, we have Nourish here on Wednesday night, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about PSA and its impact on us, and what are the things we remember from our background, and how we might shape that down the road. And then hopefully, let's see, not this Wednesday, but the Wednesday following, I hope that we will be joined in Nourish by our ecumenical partners from Germany. The KO conference our denomination's conference has a relationship with the churches in West Germany, the Evangelische Kirchenstraße I'm working on my German. It's the Protestant churches in Western Germany and in Baden, the Baden region, and their bishop and a couple other people from there will be over here. So I'm hoping they'll join us for Nourish. That'll be kind of interesting, like to hear their take on all of that and where they come from and how they're looking at that model or not looking at that model, especially in the way of what it says to us about the myth of redemptive violence, which is, I think, a very important aspect of that for us right now. Okay, friends. Bye.